Well, now we're at the part of the course which is more like conventional philosophy of science. If this were a conventional course in the philosophy of social science, this is where I would start, would be with the lecture of last time and today, where you begin by saying, well, in the philosophy of the social sciences, there are two general strands, two general types of opinion. There is the one that emphasizes interpretation, and that is sometimes called hermeneutics. And the reason it's called hermeneutics is that's what hermeneutics means. It means interpretation. Please don't tell me, no, there's a guy named Nutix and his first name is Herman. No, that's a different guy. We're not talking about that Herman. Interpretation versus sometimes called explanation. And these are another way of making this distinction is between naturalism over here and hermeneutics or interpretation over here. And the ideas behind these two, roughly speaking, on this side, it's that the form of explanation in the social sciences is really exactly like the form of explanation in the natural sciences. It's that the data are a little more complicated and it's messier and there are too many interfering factors, so you don't get an element theory. But basically you try to assume things under covering laws. And that means you employ the deductive, I won't write it all out, the deductive nomological model of explanation or the hypothetical deductive conception of scientific investigation. And I gave you some hints about that last time, but I'll say more about it this time. Now on this side, the basic idea is not that you're trying to give a scientific explanation, but you're trying to get an understanding. And the key notion here is verstehen. The key notion that goes with hermeneutics is verstehen, where verstehen just means understanding. But here it's understanding as opposed to explanation. And the reason that it's hermeneutical is that in order to get an understanding of social phenomena, you have to interpret it. Thus, the study of history and the study of social sciences are really like the interpretation of a text. As you interpret a text by trying to decipher the meaning of the text, so you have to think of a society and social changes and social behavior as like texts, and what you try to do is decipher the meaning of those texts. And that differs from the natural sciences, where the natural sciences you just seek causes. Now there is a sort of background flavor to these things, and that is these people like to think of themselves as more in the tradition of the sciences, and these people like to think of themselves as more in the tradition of the humanities, though I don't want to exaggerate the extent of that. But clearly there is a sort of good guy, bad guy flavor to these discussions. If you think that the good guys are over here, you think these guys are a bunch of muddle-headed Germans whose names start with H, and God knows what they're going to say next. On the other hand, if you're sympathetic with these guys, you think these guys are a bunch of Philistine, superficial Anglo-Saxon empiricists who never had a deep thought in their life and wouldn't know one if you hit them over the head. And the names of the guys over here are Dilthey. I mean, these are some of the all-time champions of this. Dilthey, well, of course, Hegel, for God's sake, yes. And then more recently, Habermas is on this side, and Ricoeur. And a guy I'm actually asking you to read because he writes fairly clearly, and that's Chuck Taylor, Charles Taylor. And on this side, well, the all-time champion is Hempel. And a more ambiguous case over here is Davidson, but clearly his heart is on this side, even though he makes some interesting changes in the model of explanation, and then Fodor tries to improve or tries to give variations and improvements into the standard deductive nomological model. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you about each of these. One of the great things that this side emphasizes is something called the hermeneutic circle. And the hermeneutic circle is supposed to be this. If you think of interpreting a text, then it's clear that you have to interpret the text line by line or word by word. But of course, you can only interpret a sentence of the text in the light of the interpretation of the whole text, and you can only interpret the whole text in light of the interpretation of the sentences. Now that might seem rather obvious and superficial, but there's something to it. If you actually try to do translation, my favorite is Mallarmé because he's untranslatable. And what is amazing about Mallarmé is that the same poem given by different Stéphane Mallarmé, the same poem translated by different competent translators will look quite different in English. And it's clear that these guys are struggling. And Mallarmé wasn't trying to make it easy, I can tell you that. If you read it in the original French, it's not much better. In fact, I think it's probably worse. But in any case, there is a problem about translation. And any translator will tell you you have to understand the occurrence of the word in light of the context of the whole, but you understand the whole in light of your interpretations of the particular words. And this is the hermeneutic circle. I don't think it's, in real life, I don't think it's such a big deal. I mean, if you're asked to interpret how are the Democrats dealing with their problems in the current election, well, you can only discuss that in light of a much larger hermeneutic phenomenon, namely Obama's victory 2 years ago and the whole history of the increasing partisanship in Washington and the demonization of each side by the other side, and so on. So in real life, I don't think it creates such a terrible problem to say, well, you have to interpret this election in light of the larger context, and you interpret the larger context in light of the specific details. There is a kind of puzzling character about some of this, because at certain points it's made to appear mysterious. And the idea is that somehow or other you have to have a certain kind of empathy with the characters whose behavior you are describing, or you can't fully understand them. You have to sort of get inside their minds, and you can't do it just by the methods of the natural sciences. And there is a notion that's often used on this side, which I literally do not understand, and maybe somebody can explain it to me, and that is intersubjectivity. And I think if it has a clear meaning, it must mean collective intentionality. But they don't make it very clear to me. I taught a seminar with Habermas on this kind of stuff in Frankfurt, and this notion, I didn't think Habermas and another guy over on this side is Karl Otto Appel, and I never did get clear about what they meant by intersubjectivity. But if somebody's got an explanation of it, that would be helpful. But in the meantime, I treat intersubjectivity to mean collective intentionality. The thing that makes it puzzling is this. At certain points, Taylor says you mustn't think of the common meanings that go to make up social phenomena as if they were just in the heads of individuals. No, they're out there in the world. Now, what is that supposed to mean? He gives the example. There are two different kinds of meanings that he talks about. There are the common meanings and the intersubjective meanings. And the common meanings would be general ideals like freedom and democracy. And the intersubjective meanings would be things like the practice of negotiations. So in a democracy like this one, you have a practice whereby people try to resolve disputes by negotiating the terms of the dispute. And they have labor management negotiations and various ways of trying to resolve these, and then ways of taking it to the streets, such as going on strike, and various other such methods. But the idea is, according to Taylor, that the intersubjective phenomenon should not be construed as being in the heads of individuals. And I literally don't know what that is supposed to mean. That seems mysterious to me. It's got to be in the heads of the individuals involved. Otherwise, I can't figure out its ontology. As I've told you before, collective intentionality must be in the heads of individuals simply because there's no place else for it to be. But I think Taylor objects to that. Okay, now that's the general layout of the territory, and now I'm going to tell you some of the difficulties that I began on this last time. I'm going to tell you some of the difficulties with this model, with the deductive nomological model of explanation. Any questions so far? How are we doing? Everybody's up with us? Okay, well, let's go ahead then with the story I started to tell last time. And I have to say that actually some other names on this side. I think we got to put Collingwood over here among these guys. Whatever else we may think of it, the deductive nomological model of explanation has a kind of elegance. It's rather beautiful in its symmetry. And the idea is this: all of science is part of one great big science. And in order for that to be the case, the laws of the higher level sciences, such as economics, sociology, political science, must be reducible to the laws of the more basic sciences until you get back to the laws of physics. Otherwise, it would become a mystery. And let me nail that down to practical cases. When I was a kid, there used to be a lot of people I would argue with called Marxists. They seem to have disappeared. I kind of miss them. But they've just, I don't even know any Marxists on our faculty. There used to be a whole lot of them. But now they all got discredited. The wind blew in a different direction somehow. But in any case, they all had a theory that society was governed by inexorable laws. And these laws made it inevitable that the capitalist system would be overthrown by a revolution. This followed from the laws of history that Marx himself had developed. And the puzzle I always had, and still do have, is this: if there's going to be a revolution, then the laws that predict the revolution have to be consistent with, and indeed they have to be reducible to, the laws of history. Why? Because whatever else a revolution it involves a lot of molecule movements. And if the laws that predict the molecule movements don't have the molecules moving the right day on the days of the revolution, there can't be a revolution. Think of a revolution as like a picnic. If nobody brings the molecules, you can't have a picnic. And if nobody brings the ants or the sandwiches, you can't have a picnic. And similarly with a revolution. If the molecules are blowing the wrong way on the day of the revolution, there won't be a revolution. Now that's a very crude way of getting the point across that there has to be some kind of a match between the laws at the higher level and the laws at the lower level if the events are actually going to happen the way they're predicted at the higher level. And it is not at all clear how this would come about. Now, I drew you the standard parallelogram that's supposed to do it. You have the laws at the higher level that predict you will have state 1 goes to state 2, and that this only works because there's a more basic physical level whereby physical state 1 goes to physical state 2. And as I mentioned, the standard textbook example is the reduction of the laws of gas behavior, Boyle's law and Charles' law, to the laws of statistical thermodynamics. Now the key notion here is the notion of a bridge law, the law that connects the laws at the higher level to the laws at the lower level. And the difficulty that the deductive nomological model always had was, what are the bridge laws supposed to look like? You can do it for a few examples in physics and chemistry, though it ought to surprise us that the textbooks always give the same examples, and I know that because I've used the same damn examples myself. I used this one in a book I wrote called Minds, Brains, and Science. But this ought to be the case across the board. Now, sometimes they modify it and they say, well, you don't have to have a precise, exact reduction, but you have to have more or less a smooth reduction of the higher level phenomena to the lower level phenomena. Okay, well, the first thing to notice is it didn't work. Nobody succeeded in getting this type of elegant reduction where the social sciences were concerned. Yes, you can do it for physics and chemistry, and it's quite impressive. But how is it supposed to work for economics and political science, and how indeed is it even supposed to work for psychology? All right, now let's leap ahead a bit. And Fodor thought he had a way of modifying this model of the unity of science, and he wrote it in an article called The Disunity of Science. There was a classic article written by Putnam and Oppenheim called The Unity of Science as a Working Hypothesis. And Fodor called his article A Disunity of Science. Is there a subtitle? Do you remember? I think there may be a subtitle. But anyway, all these guys, I guess we all do, like cutesy titles. So Fodor had this, The Disunity of Science as a Working Hypothesis, or some such. And what Fodor says is this, and this was a key notion in recent intellectual life, is you have to account for multiple realizability. And the reason that this is so important to us is that we understand it as key to understanding the computational conception of the mind, that the computer can implement the same program at the higher level, even though there are different computer hardwares implementing that program. So in the computer model, you have a computational story at the higher level, but this computational story will have different physical realizations, P1, P2, P3, and P4. So here you have the program that you're running. Let's suppose it's a word program. But in some versions that will be implemented in Apple hardware. In other versions it will be implemented in an IBM hardware, and so on. Same higher level phenomenon can be realized in a multiplicity of lower level hardware realizations. And that is a key to understanding basically computer science, is that you can have the same level of description at the level, the same description at the level of the program, even though there will be different descriptions of the underlying hardware. It doesn't matter how the program is realized, as long as the hardware is stable enough and rich enough and fast enough to carry out the steps in the program. Now, Fodor took that idea and said, let's apply it to this model. Okay, I don't think his story works, but as I said, I'm going to I had root canal work this last week, and I think of giving these lectures as like a root canal. You just have to do it. I'm going to explain these guys' ideas to you, even if I'm not sympathetic with them. So here we go with Fodor. Fodor says you have the same higher level phenomenon go from S1 to S2, but these are multiply realized in, it makes it simple if I only do 4 of these, P1, P2, P3, and P4. All right, now S2 similarly will be multiply realized into P5, P6, P7, and P8. Now, here is why we don't get strict laws at the higher level. There will be a lower level law connecting P1 to P7, and P2 to P5, and P4 to P8, but P3 maybe just goes out in left field. That's the picture. And it's obvious everybody loves this picture because you see it reproduced in one bad article after another. Okay, now that's the idea he has, and he gives the example of Gresham's law. Now remember, Gresham's law says that bad money drives out good money. Well, what does that mean? Well, none of you are old enough to remember, but American coins used actually to be made of silver. There were silver dollars and silver quarters and all the rest of it. Now you have this horrible zinc copper sandwich, and it still disgusts me. If you look closely, you can see the copper from the side. It is quite disgusting. Okay, but those who can remember silver coins remember that when these fake coins were introduced, silver coins simply disappeared from circulation. As they used to say, old ladies in tennis shoes stored all their silver coins in the top drawer of their dresser. They no longer spent them. And nowadays, of course, you can never find a silver dollar in circulation for the simple reason it's worth a lot more than $1, even if you just melted it down, which is illegal if you melted it down. By the way, the copper in a penny is worth more than a penny. Such is the price of copper nowadays, and why we continue to have this useless coin in circulation, I don't know. But in any case, you have multiple realizability. And because some of these forms of realizability are held to be more valuable than others, the bad money, the money that is in the form of less desirable physical realization, will prevail in circulation, and the good money will be driven out of circulation. And you remember that is called Gresham's law, and what Gresham's law says is bad money drives out good money. I mean, I'm sure there are mathematical ways of stating it, but that's the way that it is standardly described. Okay, now, is that going to work? Is that going to explain why? What's the question we're trying to answer? The question we're trying to answer is, granted the unity of reality, granted that explanation consists of subsuming something under a law, how do we account for the fact that the social sciences, whatever their advances, have not been anything like reducible to the natural sciences in a way that this picture would suggest, in a way that we can reduce the gas laws to the laws of statistical thermodynamics, in a way that we can reduce the chemical bond to quantum mechanics. How are we supposed to reduce economics and political science, or even for that matter psychology, to the laws of physics? And Fodor's answer is the reason the reduction fails is not because there's something wrong with the idea that reality is one, that reality is unified, but rather what allows for exceptions, that the laws are not strict laws, is that the multiple realizability of the higher level phenomena will allow for realizations into a lower level physical phenomena that has different forms of behavior with the second stage of the realization. So you may get a perfect match between P1 and P7, but you don't get a good match between P3 and any of these realizations. It goes out into left field. You get an exception. Those that are realized in this form will be exceptional. Now, is that going to explain the failure of this model? I don't think it works at all. But let me give you a case where something like it does work. If you've ever had a course in geology, one of the things they tell you is why rivers produce these half-moon lakes. They produce these bends. And the reason it happens is this. If you get a small curve in a river produced by, let's say, natural features of the terrain, as the water flow is on the inside of the bend. It deposits more of the dirt that it's carrying, but here it flows faster on the outside and digs away more of the bank. And this process will continue for a long time until you get a kind of great big curve. And if you've ever flown in a plane over flat valleys, you can see how the rivers curve around. It's really quite amazing how they curve around. And it's the operation of this law. And it's an operation of Bernoulli's principle, if we're going to get to the physics of it, that the water moving faster here will dig away more at the bank, and the water moving slower here will deposit more of the sediment being carried by the stream, and that produces an increase in the size of the curve. Eventually there's a flood, and the water breaks over the banks and leaves a lot of these so-called half-moon lakes on a flat field, on any flat field. Now, that law doesn't work strictly because, for example, when they built the California water system to steal our water and give it to people in L.A., as Northern Californians will constantly assure you, they made the damn canals out of concrete. And guess what? This doesn't work with concrete. It works with dirt and mud of various kinds. It'll even sort of work with sandstone. But if you got reinforced concrete, maybe even put in a few steel braces on the bends, it isn't going to work. So you have multiple realizability. If this is the concrete one here, then it doesn't produce. The law doesn't operate there. The curve remains constant because the action of the water is insufficient to dislodge the shape of the concrete at the inner part of the bend that's built into the canal. What's the name of that canal? I've forgotten the name. Anyway, there is a canal that carries Northern California water to Southern California. Okay, that's where it works. But now, the interesting thing about Fodor's article, his example is Gresham's law. How's it supposed to work? I don't see that it works at all for Gresham's law. That is, we're supposed to think here, money over here can be made out of silver or gold or paper or copper or wampum or seashells or whatever. And then that's supposed to connect over here with some physical laws. But of course, that leaves out the key notion. What binds all these things together over here as money is not some disjunction of physical features, but rather the attitudes that people take. And that's the course, one of the main themes of this course. It is the collective intentionality, not the physical features, that marks those as money. So what binds these phenomena together is not a disjunction of physical properties at all. In a way, there is a disjunction of physical properties that works for digging a canal. But what binds them together as money, this is types of money. And over here, you're supposed to get hoarding or spending. This is supposed to be hoarding and spending. And what binds them together is not the physics. It's the intentionality. It's the attitude that people take. Now, I want to pause about that. Fodor thinks he's got a solution to the problem. Why did this picture fail? And his answer is, it failed because of multiple realizability of the higher level phenomena. And I say, that is not the reason. That might work for the way you explain the curvature of streams on a flat plane, where the stream will curve if it's made of mud, or if the base is gravel and dirt, but it won't work if the base is concrete or steel. But that doesn't work for the actual relation, the example he gives us, which is Gresham's law. How is it supposed to work? How are the physical properties over here supposed to be related in a law-like fashion to the physical phenomenon over here? There's nothing in the structure of silver that makes it gravitate toward the top drawer of dressers of elderly ladies in Sacramento. It's just not part of the physics of silver. It's part of the attitude that people have toward it that they regarded as more desirable. And so the essential thing that Fodor is supposed to be telling us about, namely how this operates, is left out of his account. She's going to see if she can't make her silver's really all right. Okay, does everybody get that point? That the Prince of Denmark got left out of this version of Hamlet. What makes this work over here, what really explains this, has nothing to do, or very little to do with the physics. It has to do with the collective intentionality by which we describe something as money, by which we call something money, and also then the attitudes that people take toward that phenomenon. And it'd be interesting to know how many things in history have been money. One of my favorite examples is ancient Sparta, where bars of iron were money, and the reason was people did not want anybody taking money out of town. And so they made the stuff so damn heavy that you could not possibly take it out of town. You'd need a whole lot of people to get it out of town, and you would be detected. So one way to keep money in town is to make sure that it's unliftable, unmovable. So all kinds of things can be money, but what makes it money is not physics or a disjunction of physics, but a collective intentionality. It's the attitudes. So I don't think Fodor explains, I don't think he solves our problem for us at all. I think his account is just irrelevant to the question why social phenomena are not reducible to physical phenomena. Okay, let's take questions about that, because now I'm going to go on to Davidson. Davidson has a different story to tell. Yes?
Even if what we're talking about here isn't a good example, doesn't it seem like general rules about how people will treat fiat money, commodity money, and the like might result in an imperfect connection about how money works?
I think it will, but now tell me the laws, and I think what you find out is that the laws have an irreducible intentionalistic component. And what we've got to examine is the intentionality. And that's going to be, that's going to be problematic for various reasons that you know. One is that the very same concept will have different applications relative to different backgrounds. So, for example, the concept of wealth will have a different application relative to different backgrounds. Or take religion. One of the examples that's sometimes given of a meme is the idea of God. And God, that idea is shared. But the difficulty is that different cultures have completely different ideas of God, though they may use the same word or a word that is translatable, that's supposed to be readily translatable into other languages. So you have a background phenomenon. And what makes these things, you see, it's okay to say, well, okay, all the same, there will be the attitudes that people will take will be a function of the kind of physics that we're talking about. Their attitudes to silver and gold will be different from the attitudes to silver. Yes, but we're still talking about intentionality. There's nothing in the chemical composition of gold that fixes that we're going to have a certain sort of intentionality regarding gold. Nothing in the chemical composition of copper that fixes that we're going to have a certain intentionality regarding copper. That's just a fact about how we operate. And by the way, it's worth pointing out, in the ancient world, gold and silver were regarded as pretty much comparable in value. Now we set vastly more store by gold. Gold is regarded as much more valuable, but that's a fairly recent development. By fairly recent, I mean over the past 1,000 years or so. It has not always been like that. Okay, so I don't think Fodor answers our question. The question is, why did this fail, this picture? And different aspects of that question are, why is it that we don't get strict laws of economics and political science in a way that we get strict laws of physics? And that's what Fodor thinks that he is answering, is that the laws won't be strict because there will be exceptions. But I want to say it doesn't even work for the example that he gives to sort of illustrate how it works, because it's not the multiple realizability that makes Gresham's law have exceptions. Rather, it is the structure of human intentionality. and the multiple realizability is only realizable as money because we have a certain set of attitudes, because of the intentionality in question. Okay, other questions at this point? Now I'm going to try another answer, another approach to these issues, which you get in Davidson, also one that's very influential. Questions about what we said so far? Here's a model. It's very beautiful. It says, explanation and prediction are perfectly symmetrical. To explain something is to subsume it under a law. So you explain this falling body by showing that it follows from the law of gravity that an unsupported body will fall. And you predict that it's going to fall by deducing that it's going to fall from the law of gravity. Explanation and prediction are effectively the same. It's just that explanation is about the past and prediction about the future, but they have exactly the same logical structure. And explaining something consists in subsuming it under a law. And Hempel is even willing to say that's, not willing, enthusiastic about saying that's true of social phenomena. And his favorite example is the movement of the Oklahoma Dust Bowl farmers to California. And he said that true is explained by a law. It's true that the law is kind of messy and it's really only a sort of a sketch of an explanation that we give, but you can see what it's trying to be like. You can see what the ideal is, and the reason we don't attain that ideal is we can't reproduce in society the type of pure conditions that we can reproduce in the laboratory, where I can give you a precise laboratory prediction of what's going to happen, whereas in society you have to deal with the variations and all sorts of other things that interfere and happen to upset the specificity of the prediction. Okay, now I want to turn to Davidson's. Everybody see where we are. We have this beautiful model. It doesn't work. Fodor gives us an explanation of why it doesn't work. And I want to say his explanation doesn't even deal with his favorite example, Gresham's law, because it leaves out the intentionality of the phenomena. Now, the one thing these guys on the left-hand side have is a recognition of the intentionality of the phenomena. And I think they're right about that. They're wrong about various other things. But the problem is with the guys on the right-hand side is that they don't fully understand the role of intentional causation. They think all causation is the same. It's all a matter of instantiating a universal law. Okay, so I now want to turn from this account to the Davidsonian account. Can I erase all this? Has everybody got enough of it? I'll erase this part anyhow. Now, Davidson says, when we look to the explanation of human behavior, there are three principles that look as if they were inconsistent. But they're all true, so there must be a way of making them consistent. They are, first, actions, by which he means bodily movements, are caused by beliefs and desires. BM here for bodily movement. I don't seem to have a decent piece of chalk, and each one of these is getting smaller by the second. They used to come. These rooms used to come with little boxes of chalk, but I don't see one here. I'll just struggle along. Actions caused by our old friends Bell and Des. Okay, but now, wherever there's a causal relation, there must be a causal law. This is what we know from Hume. There must be a causal law. But now, third, remember, actions here are bodily movements and hence physical. There are no psychophysical laws. Okay, has everybody got those three? The first one says that actions have intentional causation. The physical movement is typically caused by belief and desire. So, for example, I want to give an illustration of Davidson's view. I believe that I can give an illustration by raising my arm, and that belief and desire cause, guess what? My arm goes up, a physical event. Okay. But now there must be a causal law, even if it's misspelled. There must be a causal law whenever there's a causal relation. We know that from Hume. But there are no laws relating the mental and the physical. There are no psychophysical laws. No laws that state the relationships between my beliefs and desires and any physical event, such as the movement of my body. Why not? That looks like that's the crucial point. Now, part of the ingenuity of this argument is that this claim was often used by the guys on that side of the blackboard to argue against the whole point over here, to argue against there being a unity of science. Davidson wants to use it to prove exactly the reverse. This looks inconsistent because it says the actions are caused by beliefs and desires. There must be a causal law, but there are no causal laws correlating beliefs and desires. What's the way out of the inconsistency? And the inconsistency is resolved by saying that every mental event must be identical with a physical event, and the laws will be physical laws correlating some physical events with other physical events. So you don't get a law that says whenever Searle believes that by raising his arm he can make a philosophical point, and he wants to make a philosophical point, therefore he will raise his arm. There will be no such law. But there will be laws under different descriptions. We don't know what they are. Always be suspicious when philosophers tell you, we don't know what they are, but someday we'll know. But we don't know what they are, but there must be laws. We know that because there is a causal relation, and all causal relations must instantiate laws. Now, it's always been an embarrassment for the guys on this side, for Dilthey and Ricoeur and Taylor and so on, whether or not explanations of social phenomena are causal. Are they causal or not? I think they're obviously causal, but I'm going to say later on, just as I said against Fodor, the form of the causation is intentional causation. And I haven't told you the details about how intentional causation works. Okay, but we're still now with Davidson. And Davidson is saying there are no psychophysical laws, therefore the laws must be entirely physical. But now, since the laws are entirely physical, then it follows that Bell and Des are physical phenomena. They're identical with physical phenomena, and the laws will describe relationships between some physical phenomena and other physical phenomena. In other words, the apparent contradiction is resolved by postulating a form of mind-brain identity. What he's saying is every mental state has to be identical with a brain state, and we know that from the fact that it can act causally. It can only act causally if it instantiates a law, and it can only instantiate a law if it is a physical phenomenon. Therefore, every mental phenomenon is a physical phenomenon. And consequently, we will get, in a way, it's a kind of a resolution of the conflict between these two, because what it says is the explanations that will interest us in real life will be intentionalistic explanations, like the guys on the left-hand side say. But of course, there will be laws on the right-hand side, but we don't know what those laws are, and we don't need to law. No, here's what he said. All you have to know to give an explanation of a psychological phenomenon, how such and such beliefs and desires cause such and such events, you don't have to know what the law is. You just have to know that there is a law. So if you want to explain why did Hitler invade Russia, you state his beliefs and desires. He desired Lebensraum in the East. That means living room. He wanted space for Germans to expand. He wanted Lebensraum in the East, and he believed that there was plenty of Lebensraum going on there. There's plenty of Lebensraum in Russia and in Poland and in Ukraine. So he invaded Russia as a way of getting all of this space. Now, says Davidson, he doesn't use this example, but you can see how he would deal with it. There has to be a law because there is a causal relation. We're explaining Hitler's behavior, in terms of his mental states. There has to be a law, but the law will not be stated in mental terms. It will be stated entirely in physical terms. The law will correlate one physical state with another physical state, and we don't have to know what the law is in order to make the causal explanation. We just have to know that there is a law. We don't have to know what the actual law is. We just need to know that there is some law or other that covers the case, which eventually we'll be able to find out, but we don't know now. So this is a famous argument in Davidson. It's supposed to prove the identity of mind and brain, and it proves it by using an argument that is sometimes given in favor of the dualists. The dualists say, well, if there really were these causal relations, there'd have to be laws, but there aren't any laws. Therefore, dualism is right. The mind is an autonomous phenomenon. And Davidson is saying, no, there are these causal relations. There must indeed be laws. There are no psychophysical laws. But what follows is not that the mind is an autonomous phenomenon, but rather the mind is just a feature of the brain, and the laws will be stated entirely in physical terms. Yes?
So when you say things like that it's up to the brain guys to figure out what the deal is with being realized in and caused by, is that a similar form of hand-waving?
Yes, I think I've been waiting for these guys to solve this problem now for the past 30 years, and that guys are not solving it. Now, let me tell you about this. There is a leading problem in biology today. And for a long time, most biologists, even neurobiologists, refuse to recognize this problem. I've been nagging them for years, and now they've come around. I don't take credit for their coming around. I think they had all kinds of reasons for coming around. But the way they come around to is this. We need to explain exactly how causal processes in the brain cause consciousness and intentionality, and exactly how consciousness and intentionality are realized in the brain. This debate has gone on for a long time, and there are a very large number of books about it, and none of them has succeeded in explaining this. Now, a priori, I'm convinced, look, we know that it happens. We know that consciousness goes on. We know that it goes on in the brain, and we know that it's entirely caused by brain processes. Now, in some cases, say my perception of red, we know quite a lot about it because we can trace the stimulus from the time it hits the retina. We can trace it down the optic nerve over the optic chiasma into the lateral geniculate nucleus, from there to the visual area 1, what used to be called Brodmann area 17 of the visual cortex, and then you get feedback back to the lateral geniculate nucleus, and so on. I won't tell you the whole story, and you keep tracking this signal until it gets right up into the prefrontal cortex, and then it causes the experience of red. Yes? And where and how exactly does that take place? Nobody knows. And there are lots of different theories, and I reviewed a lot of these, and if you want to see those reviews, there's a book by me called The Mystery of Consciousness, where I discuss various attempts to do this. Nonetheless, I'm still forced to keep waving my hand. We know it happens. We know we're conscious. We know what happens in the brain, and there ought to be a causal relation of how it happens. We just don't know how it happens. Now, I'm currently reviewing another book which is even more mysterious than the others, and it's by Antonio Damasio. The others were by Francis Crick and Christoph Koch and Jerry Edelman and a whole lot of other famous neuroscientists. And the idea they had was you will be able to find a correlate between consciousness and a brain process. There must be some difference between a conscious brain and an unconscious brain, or if I shift from one conscious state to another, there must be some corresponding shift in my brain. This is put by saying that mental states are supervenient on brain processes. For any change in a mental state, there must be a corresponding change in the supervenient base of the brain, and that's because mental states are supervenient on brain states. Okay, so it looks like the steps are clear. You got to get first a correlation. You find, and it's even got a name now, it's called the NCC, the neuronal correlate of consciousness. And then you test to see if the NCC is really a causal relation. And how do you do that? Usual methods. You see if you can turn off consciousness by turning on the turning off the NCC, and can you turn it back on by turning on the NCC? And then you get a theory. And those are the three stages that work throughout the history of science. They work for the germ theory of disease. You get correlations, you test to see if the correlations are causal, and then you get a theory as to why there's a causal relation between entities of this kind and phenomena of that kind. Now, that has not been working for brain research. Why not? Well, I hope one of you will figure out the answer to that, or maybe a whole team of you will, because you'll get a Nobel Prize when you figure that out, why it didn't work and what is the right method to make it work. But it isn't working. It turns out the unconscious brain looks a lot like the conscious brain. If you do your scans while the guy's asleep, you got all kinds of things going in REM sleep. And I'm reviewing another book now by Damasio, and he abandons this picture. He says, no, you got to bring in the self, because it's the self that creates consciousness. Well, thanks a lot. That's giving us another mystery for the two we had already. One was a mystery how the brain works, and the other is how consciousness works. And he's thrown in another one. What the hell is the self? And I'm only on what page are we on now? About page 200 of Damasio's book. And I'm going to keep going with that. And I'll report back next week to see if Damasio solved the problem. But I'm sorry to say, I don't think he has. I lose a lot of friends by reviewing their books in the New York Review, because I don't see any way to conceal from the general public that they have failed. Too bad. But anyhow, yes.
So the Davidson, there's one event, and it has multiple descriptions. So
Yeah.
you have a thought, and then it has an actual description. Or you have an event that you did something, an intentional action has one description at the mental level,
Mm-hmm.
and there's another description at the physical level, at the brain level. And the brain level has causation built into it.
Yes.
So it's law-like, and then therefore determined.
Yeah.
But at the higher level, which cannot be reducible down to the physical description, the mental states, there's no echo, as he says, in
Yeah.
physical descriptions, that is not law-like, therefore it's not determined.
Well, no, that doesn't follow. You see, let me go through the steps. The key premise to establish for Davidson, I don't think it's, I think this one is suspicious for reasons I've already hinted at, but I'll tell you. But he thinks the key premise for him to establish is that there are no psychophysical laws. Now he says, why not? Why are there no psychophysical laws? And the answer is the ontology of the intentional, the ontology of the psychology requires rationality. Rationality is constitutive of intentional states. And as he says, rationality has no echo in physics. There's nothing in physics that corresponds to rational constraints. So a guy can only have a belief and a desire within a context of presupposed rationality. But since there is no echo of rationality in physics, there can't be any way of matching in a law-like fashion his beliefs and desires with physical phenomena. Now, I think that's not a very strong argument, but that is actually the argument he gives. The key mediating term in this, there are no psychophysical laws, the answer is because of rationality, because the constitution of the psychological requires rationality as a constitutive principle. First you, then you. Well, that's still Jennifer first. What?
Yeah, but that's what I said.
Yeah.
Is at the higher level, then, it's not determined.
No.
Psychologically, no psychophysical laws
Yes, but
can't be determined.
yeah, no. Here's what he's saying. If the physical is determined and the psychological is identical with the physical, then the psychological is determined. It's just not determined under a psychological description. So there's no way just knowing my psychology to predict the next state of my psychology. But if you had a perfect deterministic science of the brain, you could predict the next state of my psychology under a physical description. So it's relative to a description. And relative to a psychological description, you won't get sufficient conditions for making the prediction. But remember, every psychological state is identical with a brain state. And the brain states are predictable. The brain states are completely determined. Yes, Vanessa.
Okay, so the reason that rationality, to say it's because of rationality doesn't really do full justice to his argument. His argument is that reasons and intentionalistic explanations operate in a holistic manner. And
Yeah.
that's something that
Yeah.
with it also. And it's because at the intentionalistic level, everything is holistic, that you can't reduce it to a one-one sort of explanation that you get at the physical level. So it seems like the sticking point between you guys might actually be that at the end of the day, you say that when we act on a reason, we act on some single reason, and you pick out something to serve as the one to the other one, whereas he thinks that you're never going to be able to pick out just one reason that you act on, and it's that holistic
No,
aspect.
I think we share the holism, but he thinks rationality is constitutive of the psychological in a way that makes psychophysical identity impossible. Now, I find that very unconvincing. Let's suppose that Chomsky was right when he postulated a universal grammar that we're born with. We're all born with this universal grammar that enables us to learn any natural human language. If so, that universal grammar will consist of a set of rules that are realized in the neurobiology. And I don't see any reason why the requirements of rationality prevent us from finding specific areas in the language portions of the brain where the rules of universal grammar are realized. Why you couldn't have a psychophysical identity, why you couldn't get a law-like match, that the statement of the laws of universal grammar and the corresponding statement of the laws of neurophysiology gave you psychophysical laws. If you're in this state, you're going to accept the rule that sentences have both a noun phrase and a verb phrase. I don't see any theoretical problem with that, and the constraints of rationality don't seem to block that. Yeah, other people have their hand up. Yes?
Why can't we have a diagram like that but upside down? So we have the higher level multiplicity of high level possibilities
Yeah?
with one lower level physical.
Yeah, you could do that too. Yeah. I mean, you could have a coin which was both made of silver and was both useful as money, both an object of religious veneration and a wedding gift. That's okay. Well, no, on my account, I mean, here you have a piece of silver, which it's the same piece of silver, but it's got multiple functions. It functions both as a wedding gift, a coin, and what was the third thing I said? Anyway, oh yeah, real object of religious veneration. That's okay. But you still, on my account, you still want to be able to say what marks these as three different phenomena are different intentionalities. This is the coin, this is the gift, and this is the sacred. But what for me is going to, the driving force of all psychological and social explanation is intentional causation. And none of these guys I've asked you to read has an adequate grip on intentional causation. However, I'm not going to tell you what I think in this lecture. I'm telling you what all these other guys think. Sometimes I lose control of myself and tell you why I think they're wrong. But basically my idea is to explain other people's views. Okay, are you happy with that?
Well,
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't understand fully why you're so committed to denying number 3. It seems like it would cost you nothing
Yeah.
to go with that.
I don't think there are very many psychophysical laws, but I think the argument given is inadequate. The argument given is because rationality constrains the ontology of the psychological, there can't be any psychophysical laws. I think that's poor. There's no reason why rationality couldn't be realized neurobiologically. And here's an example. If the laws of universal grammar are realized in our brain, there might perfectly well be a type-type identity between this brain state and this law of grammar. Suppose you have a law that says all sentences are composed of noun phrases and verb phrases. You can mess around with the order. You can put the noun at the, you can put the main verb at the end, the way that Germans do to annoy the rest of us, or you can put it somewhere else. And you can put the adjective after the verb as the, or you can put the adjective after the noun as the French do. They can continue to say la Maison Blanche instead of the White House, but you know that's, I mean, it's just you have to forgive the French. They don't know any better. Okay. So you just have to go with that. There are all these variations, but the basic structure might well be a case where the neurobiology realizes the laws. I don't see a problem with that. And in fact, if you look at vision, there are psychophysical laws. You have this type of psychophysical state, you're going to see red. That's what or at least those are the laws we're trying to find, and we're making progress with things like color vision. So I think that Davidson is right that there aren't very many psychophysical laws for reasons having to do with reasons I'll give you, like the background and the way that intentionality is interpreted only relative to a background of social practices. But it's not that rationality as such makes it impossible that there could be psychophysical laws. I don't think that's it. But the real problem here is this one. Why should there be a causal law for every causal statement? Yes?
So if you accept on Davidsonian account, and the account that you just gave, that I know you
Yeah.
don't believe, multiple realizability is
Yeah.
possible, but once the state is realized, then you have a kind of determinism.
Yeah. I think Davidson is a complete determinist. What he says is that for every causal statement there must be a universal and exceptionless law. You can't have sort of laws with exceptions. You've got to have a universal law, otherwise you don't have a causal relation. And by the way, these guys who believe this have always had a problem with statistical laws, because if you say, well, suppose something happens 80% of the time, then if you want to explain its occurrence, well, it's one of the 80%. Suppose it didn't happen. Well, it's one of the 20%. Well, thanks a lot, because now the explanation looks like it. You use the same explanation whether it happens or doesn't happen, and that ought to arouse our suspicions. And later on, I will express some more of those suspicions. Yes?
Do I understand right that something like a mental or an economic phenomenon is multiply realizable physically? That there's no guarantee that you'll be able to get laws in the higher level sciences and economics?
This is the Fodor line. And the Fodor line is not that you can't get laws at the higher level, but that the laws you get may admit of exceptions, because the statement of the initial conditions over here and the statement of the consequences over here do not give you a perfect match between the physics over here and the physics over here, because some of these physical phenomena may go out there. And that would be the case with our law about the increasing curvature of streams inside a flat plane subject to water flow. That's this example over here. And that does work for this case. If you make your stream out of concrete, the law doesn't operate. It's an exception. But it's not like that with money. What binds money together is not the physics, but the attitude. It doesn't matter what the physics of the money is, whether or not they use big computers or small computers or have dollar bills or whatever. What matters about money is the attitudes that people take toward it.
I see. I think I understand that. And Davidson, it sounds like he's saying something similar, that even if that, I mean, is his point that we don't know that we can get psychological laws?
No, his point is that there cannot be psychophysical laws. He has an a priori argument that there cannot be psychophysical laws because the ontology of the psychology is constrained by rationality. Now, there's another difficulty in Davidson that I haven't mentioned, and that is he thinks that the very existence of mental states is a function of the interpretation that we give. I don't think that's right. I mean, I have the mental states I have regardless of how other people interpret me. But he thinks calls it triangulation. You have to have three agents involved in order to attribute a psychological state to anybody. There has to be the person who has a psychological state, and then you have these two observers who can interpret it. That's a muddle. My brain states fix my psychological states. It's true it's relative to a background and a culture, but I get that culture realized in my brain. So that's another problem with Davidson. But I think we can state this point independently of that. But to put that problem in words of one syllable, Davidson thinks that the very existence of mental states depends on the interpretation that people give to you, and that their interpretation only makes sense of ascribing mental states if they assume you're rational. Now, I think that's wrong in various ways. I think people can have completely irrational beliefs. Davidson says if somebody had an irrational belief, we wouldn't be able to understand it. I think we often do. And indeed, people say that it's a mystery that, for example, there should be a deity who is in fact at one and the same time 3 and 1. And they don't seem to think, well, my God, we're out of business because we got something that's logically inconsistent. They think, on the contrary, precisely because it's a mystery, it is more an object of our veneration. I mean, pick your favorite religion. I happen to know this one better than others because I was partly brought up in it. But every religion, I think, probably has some set of propositions that people in other religions regard as simply irrational, and yet we have no problem in attributing. Well, I guess we have no problem in attributing them. Yes?
Yeah, but we don't put religions within the realm of rationality. They're outside.
Well, but now you see, but let me just see. I agree with that. We don't put religions in the realm of rationality. Davidson is saying you cannot have the existence of beliefs except in the realm of rationality. That if somebody had an irrational belief, we couldn't make sense of it. We couldn't even attribute it. You can only attribute it given the presupposition of rationality, and that's what leads to this, that there can't be any psychophysical laws because the constraints of rationality don't carry over to physics. I think that's a weak argument, but that is his argument. Okay, other questions about this? All right, now how many of these guys did I get through? I got through Fodor, and I got through Hempel. Well, all right, let's go back to Hempel. You see, I haven't been telling you what I think. What I think is that the covering law model doesn't even work for physics. It only works because we assume the law cites an actual cause. The reason that we think you can explain this by citing the law of gravity is the law of gravity mentions a force. Bodies attract with a force that's inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them and directly proportional to the product of their mass. And force names a real cause in the real world. Now, why doesn't everybody say that? And the answer is because Hume taught them that you can't say that. There are no such things as forces. And I think that's one of the great disasters in the history of Western philosophy. Well, one of the great, there's so many, I don't know where to start, but one of the great disasters in the history of Western philosophy was the idea that causes are not a real relation in the real world. So a key problem here is this assumption that there must be a causal law, and people assume that because they assume unless there's a causal law, there's nothing for causal statements to be about. Okay, I'm going to come back to that, but now I want to turn to Hempel. Hempel thinks all explanations must consist in subsuming a phenomenon under a causal law. And his example of explaining the behavior at the social level is explaining the movement of dispossessed Oklahoma Dust Bowl farmers to California. And the idea that he has is we will be able to explain the movement of these people by showing that their movement exemplified a general law. And what is the general law? Well, he says it's embarrassing. He was a very honest guy. He says it's very difficult and embarrassing to try to state it precisely, but it's something like this. If people perceive that their present situation is undesirable, indeed intolerable, then they will be inclined to migrate, to move to a place where they will perceive the situation or where they believe the situation to be better. So he says there is a law, it's just that it's not a strict law of the kind that we can give in the natural sciences, but it's what enables the explanation to explain. But now he goes further. Unless there were some such a generalization, some such a law, the explanation wouldn't explain anything. You would not be able to explain. It would be a total mystery. Because if you say, well, why did this family move to Southern California from the Oklahoma Dust Bowl? And you say, well, it's because they thought life would be better in California. If that's a causal statement, then there must be a law for reasons that Davidson and Hempel agree on. A causal statement can only state a truth if it exemplifies a causal law. And just about everybody in philosophy agrees to that, but I think it's mistaken. I think there are lots of causal statements that do not exemplify causal laws. They just tell you which forces produced which effects. Well, what does cause mean then if it doesn't mean exemplifies a law? Or what cause, when you state the cause of something, You're telling what made it happen, what forces acted on it in such a way as to produce its happening. Now, if you have that conception of causation, then the explanatory force of the law does not describe from its syntactical structure as a universal generalization stating a co-occurrence, but rather the explanatory force of the law derives from the fact that the law states a common force, a force that acts over a potentially infinite number of cases. So explaining something causally is not a matter of subsuming it under a law. On the contrary, subsuming it under a law only explains if the law states a force. So subsuming something under the law of gravity explains because we tacitly assume gravity to be a force. If it's just a universal co-occurrence, it doesn't explain anything. Why is the sun shining now in Berkeley? Well, because there is a law. First you have daylight and then you have dark, and it goes on all the time in Berkeley. There's a universal correlation between daylight and dark. That doesn't explain why we have it. If you want to know why we have it, you have to explain the causes, namely the rotation of its Earth on the axis relative to the sun. And I won't. You can tell the whole story yourself. But what I'm suggesting is universal co-occurrence relations don't explain anything. They appear to explain something if the statement of the universal co-occurrence actually cites a cause, actually cites a force. That's why the law of gravity explains. But can we actually give examples of things where something causes something else and there is no law? I think we give lots of examples. I mentioned one earlier, but I'll mention it again. Between the wars, there were a very large number of books published on the causes of the First World War. Now, I won't say which one of these I thought was right, and they came out all sorts of different levels, but assuming that the First World War is explicable, and it is explicable, there must be some answer to the question, well, what caused the First World War? And I think my own view is it was caused by a whole lot of psychological factors. The Europeans hadn't had a war since 1815. They'd had a whole century without any war. They had an exaggerated level of nationalism, and basically they wanted a fight. And then it didn't take much to trigger that fight. The assassination of the Archduke led people to feel that a terrible outrage had occurred, that the Serbs had done some horrible thing against humanity and needed to be punished. And then the dominoes started to fall because, of course, Russia was allied with the Serbs. Germany was allied with the Austrians. And then a whole lot of other factors came into play. The French and the British were allied with each other and with the Russians. Now, this was a bit of a scandal. Well, how the hell can you be allied with the Russians? Well, they're allied with the Russians against the Germans, so that made it more palatable, but still awkward. And you tell this whole story, and a whole lot of other things came into play. Mobilization in Russia. How the hell do you mobilize Russia, for God's sake? And once you start mobilizing it, you can't turn the switch off. The other thing is all those damn railway timetables in West Germany. See, in West Germany, every little village had a railway platform big enough to accommodate a whole division. Now, you get the division there, you get them standing on the platform on this village of Kleindorf am Bachlein, some dinky little village, and the train comes in and you're going to say, don't get on the train? That's what you've been planning for many years. So everybody gets on the train and the whole thing has started to move. The avalanche has begun to move. So it's a whole lot of factors. Now, I don't know that the story I gave you is right, but something like it has to be right. The First World War is intelligible, and it must be intelligible in terms of a whole lot of intentional causation as well as a whole lot of other structural features, like the difficulty of mobilizing the Russian army. I won't tell you about the difficulty of mobilizing the Russian army, or the prevalence of railway timetables or the operation of the High Command. I detect that restlessness to suggest it's 3:30. Is that right? Okay. We'll go on with the First World War next time.